The stars outside Earth's atmosphere were nothing more than distant pinpricks of light, scattered across the velvet expanse of space. The signal had come from a sector far beyond the reach of most galactic empires. The coordinates alone should have told anyone that responding would be reckless, but Earth's military command had never been a group to back down. Admiral Tessa Kane stood on the bridge of the Terran flagship Lionheart, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. She had received the message just hours earlier, a cry for help from a coalition of alien species who had once believed themselves invincible. They were facing a force so terrifying that their combined strength was futile. They had fought back valiantly, but there was no hope left, no reinforcements, no solution. They had called for the strongest force in the galaxy, hoping that Earth's military might could tip the scales. Admiral Kane knew the risks better than anyone. The Lionheart was humanity's pride. Its fleet was considered the most powerful in the galaxy. Earth had spent decades building its military not just to defend its borders, but to show its enemies that humanity was not to be underestimated. Every part of their fleet was designed with one goal in mind: to ensure Earth would always have the upper hand. The Terran vanguard had faced countless challenges before, but this would be different. The coalition's distress call was more than a plea for help. It was a test, a trial for humanity's mettle, to see if Earth truly could stand against the unknown and win. She stepped down from the observation deck and walked toward her command chair. The bridge crew was already busy, preparing for the jump into the sector, coordinating with the fleet's other ships, making sure every last detail was accounted for. Their confidence was palpable. The Lionheart and its fleet of warships were no strangers to danger, yet this felt different. Kane could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. If they didn't succeed, if they failed in any way, the repercussions would be devastating, not just for Earth, but for the galaxy itself. As the fleet's command center hummed with life, Kane allowed herself a moment to reflect on the choices that had led her here. Across the vastness of space, Earth had become a symbol of strength, not through brute force, but through resolve. Humanity had survived countless wars, conflicts, and disasters that would have broken lesser species, and had come out stronger for it. The military was a reflection of this spirit. Every soldier, officer, and technician understood that their job was more than just to fight. They fought because they believed in the idea of victory against all odds. They fought because they knew that there was no alternative but to win. Humanity could not afford to lose, not when so much was at stake. Kane took a deep breath and straightened her uniform, her hand resting briefly on the console. Before her, the Lionheart was now ready for its jump into the unknown. As the countdown began in the background, her thoughts focused on the mission ahead. She had no doubt about her crew, no doubt about Earth's fleet, but the true test lay ahead. No one knew who or what they were about to face. All she knew was that Earth's strongest fleet was summoned, and it was time to answer that call. They would face whatever came with strength, resolve, and a determination that nothing would break, because they were human, and that was enough. The fleet emerged from the jump into the chaotic star system that had been the source of the distress signal. The scene before them was one of devastation. The sky was filled with the wreckage of destroyed ships, their hulking forms floating lifeless in the cold vacuum of space. The remnants of alien fleets that had once been so proud lay in ruins, scattered like broken toys across the stars. The once bright planets in the system had been scorched, their surfaces ravaged by the relentless bombardment from the enemy. There was no sign of the mysterious force that had caused all this destruction. Only the aftermath remained. Admiral Kane stood tall in her command chair, her eyes scanning the massive holographic display that floated before her. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but there was no time to hesitate. Every second counted as her fingers moved swiftly over the console. The Lionheart and its fleet moved into position without a word from her. The crew worked in perfect harmony, following the unspoken orders that had been ingrained in them through years of training and preparation. The Terran fleet was a machine built for war, and it would prove itself once again. The first attack came suddenly, and without warning, dozens of enemy ships appeared on the sensors, their sleek, dark forms emerging from a nearby nebula. They were fast and relentless, hitting the human fleet With pinpoint precision, their weapons were powerful, but the vanguard was faster. The human ships wove in and out of the enemy fire, their shields absorbing the blasts, as their own weapons unleashed destruction. In return, Admiral Kane's voice cut through the comms like a blade, ordering her fleet to engage. She watched with cold calculation as the human ships moved into formation, a perfectly coordinated dance that had been practiced for years. The battle escalated quickly. The enemy ships were ferocious, but they were not prepared for the might of the vanguard. Every move the humans made was a step ahead of their adversaries, their weapon systems running at full capacity, tearing through the enemy's ranks one ship at a time. The Xoreth fleet, as they were later identified, seemed disorganized in their fury. Their attacks were wild and uncoordinated, a stark contrast to the precision and strategy of the Terran fleet. The humans were taking them apart piece by piece, and the aliens seemed powerless to stop it. But just as the humans began to feel confident, a new threat emerged. A massive ship appeared out of the darkness of space, its silhouette enormous and ominous. It dwarfed anything the vanguard had faced before. This was the Xoreth flagship, a vessel unlike anything they had ever seen. Its hull was dark and jagged, its weapons glowing with an eerie green light. The very presence of the ship sent a shockwave through the battlefield. As the Xoreth regrouped around it, forming a tight defensive ring, the stakes had just been raised. Kane's eyes narrowed as she studied the new threat on the display, her mind working quickly. She knew this ship would not be easy to defeat. It was the heart of the enemy fleet, and if they couldn't take it down, the entire battle could be lost. Without hesitation, she gave the order to focus all firepower on the flagship. No more holding back. It was time to show the enemy the full might of Earth's strongest fleet. The Lionheart surged forward, its engines roaring, as it closed the distance between itself and the flagship, the other ships of the vanguard following in its wake. They moved with deadly purpose. As the first volley of weapons fire erupted from the Lionheart's cannons, the battle for the galaxy had truly begun. The flagship of the Xoreth loomed larger as the Lionheart, and its fleet closed in, its dark hull glimmering with ominous energy. The Xoreth had prepared for this moment, their defensive ring tightening around the massive ship. Like a wall of iron, the human fleet was now in the heart of the storm, and every sensor on the Lionheart was lighting up with enemy fire. The air on the bridge grew thick with tension as Admiral Kane's mind worked at full speed, calculating every move, every strategy. She knew this battle would be a turning point one way or another. The first wave of firepower from the vanguard exploded against the flagship's shields in a flash of light that could be seen for miles, even through the chaos of the battle. The shields held for a moment, but then began to flicker. The human fleet had found their target. The Xoreth flagship was powerful, but it had a weakness in its shield system. The human fleet's superior targeting systems locked onto it with precision, and the next volley of fire from the Lionheart sent a massive shockwave through the enemy formation. The flagship trembled, its shield flickering dangerously as the Xoreth tried to regroup, but the humans pressed on relentless. The alien defenders responded with fury, launching volleys of their own weapons in retaliation, but the vanguard was ready, their ships weaving and twisting through the air with deadly agility. Every blast from the enemy was dodged with near-perfect timing. The human ships responded in kind, their weapons cracking through the Xoreth ranks like a knife through paper. The Xoreth were a proud species, but they were not prepared for this level of coordination. Every time they fired, they found their weapons ineffective against the unrelenting onslaught of human tactics. Admiral Kane's eyes remained fixed on the display. She had expected resistance, but the Xoreth were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting for something much deeper, something more dangerous. They were fighting with desperation, and it showed in their unyielding attacks. But desperation was a weakness, not a strength. She knew that better than anyone. Desperation led to mistakes, led to miscalculations, and the humans would exploit that mistake when it came. The Xoreth flagship was now on the verge of collapse, its shield nearly gone. The alien forces had tried to retaliate, but the vanguard fleet was relentless, a well-oiled machine that moved with the precision of a predator. Kane could feel the tension on the bridge, her crew working faster than ever. The sound of their voices filled the room as they launched another barrage of fire from every ship at once, targeting the vulnerable spots in the enemy flagship's defenses. It was then that the unthinkable happened. A new wave of Xorth reinforcements arrived. Dozens of ships emerged from the darkness of space, coming in from all directions, their weapons blazing as they tried to make up for the damage their forces had taken. The battle had just gone from bad to worse. The human fleet was now surrounded on all sides, and though they had the advantage in terms of tactics, they were heavily outnumbered. Kane's mind raced. The fight had become a battlefield of constant shifting priorities. Every move counted. Every decision would determine the outcome of the war. Kane's voice cut through the comms as she gave the order to fall back, momentarily regroup and reassess. She knew that if they were to defeat the Xorth flagship and their reinforcements, they would need more than just strength. They needed a plan that no one would expect, and they had one. The human fleet pulled back for a moment, a tactical retreat to regroup and assess the situation. The Xorth fleet closed in around them, forming a wall of ships that blocked off any escape route. The vanguard ships formed up in tight formation, their weapons powered down for the briefest of moments as the crew scrambled to coordinate their next move. Admiral Kane stood at the center of it all, her eyes locked on the holographic display. She knew that this was a turning point. They had to act fast or be overwhelmed. The Xorth were cunning and relentless, but the humans were not unprepared. Kane quickly issued orders to her fleet. The next phase of the battle would require everything they had. While the fleet prepared for its next move, Kane focused on the intelligence they had gathered from the previous encounter. The Xorth flagship was powerful, but it was vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Its weapons could tear through ships, but it was its command center that posed the real threat to the vanguard. The flagship's central hub was located deep within its core, heavily defended, but if they could breach it, the rest of the ship would fall apart. Without its command structure, they would have a chance. Captain Olivia Frost, leader of the Vanguard's most elite boarding team, stepped forward in the briefing room, her voice steady, but her expression grim. She and her team had been training for this kind of operation for years now. It was time to put their skills to the test. She knew what was at stake, but they were ready. The mission was simple in theory. They would board the flagship, disable its command center, and take control of its systems from the inside. But the reality was far more dangerous. The flagship was a fortress, its corridors filled with traps and automated defenses designed to prevent any intrusion. Frost's team would need to be quick, efficient, and above all else ruthless. Frost's team consisted of 6 of the best soldiers Earth had to offer, each one a specialist in different forms of combat, but all were trained to operate as one unit. Every member of the team understood the importance of the mission and the risks they were about to take. Frost gathered her team together, each of them giving a nod of readiness. As she laid out the plan, they would infiltrate the flagship using the Vanguard's stealth drones to slip through the enemy's defenses. Once inside, they would split up to take out the flagship's key control points and disable its defenses from the inside. But the mission would be a race against time. If they didn't act fast, the flagship would turn its weapons on the rest of the fleet and destroy them one by one. The team boarded their shuttle and launched into the void of space, the tension palpable. Even through the quiet of the ship, the shuttle made its way toward the flagship. Through the wreckage of the battlefield, the distant sounds of fire and explosions echoing in the background. It was a sight they had all seen before, but this time the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. They had no margin for error. If they failed, the entire fleet would be lost, and the galaxy would fall to the Xorth. As they neared the flagship, Frost's team prepared to board. The mission had begun. The shuttle rocked as it entered the Xorth flagship's atmosphere. The hum of the engines was the only sound filling the cabin as Captain Frost and her team braced themselves for what was to come. Their mission was clear: infiltrate, disable the command center, and disrupt the flagship's systems from within. The shuttle pilots skillfully maneuvered through the wreckage of destroyed enemy ships. As they neared their target, the massive flagship loomed ahead, its jagged hull now closer than ever. The team's breath seemed to catch as they approached the ship's surface, a fortress waiting for their arrival. Frost looked around at her team, each of them focused and prepared for what was about to happen. They all knew the risks. There would be no second chances once they breached the flagship. There would be no going back. The shuttle slowly descended toward a hidden maintenance hatch on the underside of the flagship, a small window of opportunity they had identified after careful reconnaissance. The hatch was their only chance to get in undetected. Once they were inside, it would be a race against time to reach the command center. The shuttle doors opened with a hiss, and the team stormed out, landing on the cold metal surface of the flagship's hull. They quickly spread out, moving with purpose and precision. The mission had begun. They moved in perfect sync, their weapons drawn as they entered the maintenance shaft, their footsteps silent as they made their way into the heart of the enemy vessel. The halls were eerily quiet, but Frost knew better. The Xorath were never truly silent. They had traps everywhere, automated defense systems waiting to tear through anyone foolish enough to wander into their path. The first trap was triggered almost immediately. A blast of energy shot down the hallway. As the team split and dove for cover, Frost's heart raced as she counted the seconds before the next attack. But the team was already reacting, moving as one unit. They anticipated every move. The Xorath would make the blast miss them by inches as they returned fire, shredding the automated defenses that had attempted to ambush them. They continued forward, moving deeper into the flagship's inner corridors, all while keeping their eyes on the prize. The control room would be their next obstacle, and they had no time to waste. As they approached the control center, they encountered more resistance, a squadron of Xorath soldiers waiting in ambush behind a barricade. Frost's team didn't hesitate. The doors slid open, and the firefight began. Their weapons roared as the team pushed forward, taking out the enemy with ruthless efficiency. But the Xorath were fierce and not easily defeated. They fought back with a desperation that made them dangerous, their claws and blades flashing as they tried to force the humans back. But Frost's team was better trained, faster, and more disciplined than the Xorath had anticipated. With one last push, the Xorath soldiers fell. The control center doors ahead now only moments away, but the countdown had begun, and the flagship was about to reactivate its weapons systems. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Frost signaled her team to breach the doors. They charged forward. The team entered the control center and immediately set to work disabling the command systems. The room was a maze of complex technology, flashing lights, and unreadable alien symbols. But Frost was already 3 steps ahead, and the team quickly got to work. With seconds to spare, they hit the final switch, disabling the flagship systems and shutting down its weapons power. The team exhaled in relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The enemy would soon realize what had happened, and they would come for them with everything they had. The moment the flagship systems went dark, an alarm blared throughout the ship, signaling the breach. The Xorath forces scrambled into action, their desperation now palpable. They had lost their command center, and with it the strategic advantage. But they were not about to surrender without a fight. Frost could hear the sounds of approaching enemy forces pounding through the corridors. As her team quickly fortified their position, they had completed their primary objective. But now they had to survive long enough to escape the flagship before the Xorath could regroup and retaliate. The control center was a high-tech fortress with reinforced walls and automated defenses, but it wouldn't hold for long against the sheer weight of the enemy's response. Frost knew they had only moments before the Xorath unleashed everything they had. She quickly sent a distress signal to the Lionheart and the rest of the fleet, informing them of the success of the mission and the immediate danger they were in. The fleet was already engaged in fierce combat outside, but with the flagship's systems down, it was time to finish this fight once and for all. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder as the Xorath soldiers closed in. Frost's heart raced as she watched her team prepare for the inevitable firefight. The automated defenses in the control center had been disabled, but the enemy soldiers were relentless. Their weapons were charged, and their eyes burned with fury. The door to the control room began to shudder under the weight of the Xorath's assault forces, and Frost knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. Her mind raced for a solution. They couldn't hold this position forever. The team needed an escape route, and they needed it now. Then it hit her. The maintenance shafts they had used to infiltrate the flagship were still accessible. If they could make their way back to the shuttle, they could escape. but it would require a full-on charge through the enemy forces. There was no other choice. Frost quickly relayed the plan to her team. They would fight their way back to the maintenance hatch at all costs. She knew the risks, but it was their only shot. They moved into position, preparing for the fight ahead. The door to the control center exploded inward with a deafening crash as the first wave of Xoreth soldiers poured in their weapons, firing in every direction. Frost's team immediately returned fire with deadly accuracy, their training kicking in as they held the line. But it wasn't enough. More and more Xoreth flooded the room, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Frost's heart pounded as the fight raged around her. Her team was still holding, but their ammunition was running low, and the Xoreth forces were relentless. They couldn't afford to let up for a second. But just as the situation seemed most dire, the ground shook. The flagship trembled as the Vanguard fleet outside launched a series of coordinated strikes against the remaining Xoreth ships. The Lionheart's guns blazed to life, tearing through the remaining enemy vessels with a deadly precision. The Xoreth outside were now scrambling to defend themselves, but it was too late. The backup reinforcements the team had called for had arrived, and with their help the Xoreth soldiers began to fall back in disarray. Frost saw the shift in momentum and took advantage of it. She motioned for her team to move. They rushed toward the maintenance hatch, cutting through the remaining enemy forces. As they went, their exit was near, and they weren't about to let anything stop them now. With a final push, the team reached the hatch and dove into the maintenance shaft, the door sliding shut behind them. As they made their way back toward the shuttle, they had a narrow window of escape, but they had made it through the worst of it. The battle for the flagship was over, but the war was far from finished. As Frost and her team made their way back through the maintenance shaft, they could feel the tremors of the Vanguard fleet's assault outside. The flagship's hull was buckling under the barrage of fire from Earth's strongest ships. The Xoreth's hold on their pride was slipping away. The sound of enemy forces retreating reverberated through the ship, but it wasn't over yet. The team was still in danger. Their escape had been hard fought, but it wasn't guaranteed. The maintenance shafts were narrow, winding tunnels that offered no protection and no cover, only a winding path that led them back to the shuttle. It was a race against time. They needed to get there before the Xoreth regrouped and launched a counteroffensive. Frost's hand gripped her weapon tighter as she led the way down the narrow corridor, her team behind her moving swiftly but cautiously. Every turn and every creak of the ship's metal frame sent a chill through her. The Xoreth were not the type to give up easily. She knew they would be hunting them down. Even now, every second they spent in the shaft brought them closer to danger, but also closer to safety. She could hear the distant sound of the shuttle's engines humming in the distance. It was their lifeline, and the closer they got to it, the more the weight of the situation began to lift. They reached a junction in the shaft where they had to make a sharp turn. Frost signaled for the team to stop and listened intently. She could hear the sounds of footsteps echoing through the walls. Enemy soldiers were closing in on their location, moving swiftly and decisively. Frost cursed under her breath. They were so close, and yet so far. The Xoreth had clearly anticipated their route and had set up an ambush. The team had no choice but to fight their way through. Frost signaled for the team to fan out as they prepared for the incoming assault. Their weapons were ready, but the Xoreth were relentless and well-armed. Frost's heart pounded as she positioned herself at the front of the team. They had no choice. Now they had to hold this position long enough to push through and make it to the shuttle, but the enemy was already upon them. The first wave of Xoreth soldiers rounded the corner, weapons raised and firing. Frost's team opened fire. In response, the sound of gunfire rang through the air as the two sides clashed in a cramped corridor. The Xoreth were powerful and their weapons deadly, but Frost's team was faster. Their shots were more precise, their movements more fluid. They fought with a deadly precision that only years of training and experience could provide. The Xoreth stumbled as they tried to adjust, but it was too late. The human soldiers had already cut them down one by one. The hallway was filled with smoke and the stench of burning metal as the firefight raged on. But it was clear who had the advantage. The humans fought with a fury that the Xoreth could not match. With the last of the enemy soldiers taken down, Frost signaled for the team to move out. They couldn't waste any more time. They had to reach the shuttle now. As they moved forward, Once more the walls of the maintenance shaft seemed to close in around them. But Frost kept her focus ahead. They were so close now, and every step brought them nearer to safety. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to let the Xoreth stop them now. When they finally reached the shuttle, Frost took a breath of relief. The hatch opened, and the team boarded quickly. The shuttle lifted off from the flagship's surface. Just as the last of the Xoreth forces began to regroup, the battle outside was still raging, but the flagship was no longer a threat. The Vanguard had won, and Frost's team had made it out alive. The shuttle shot through space as the flagship grew smaller in the distance. The mission was over, and the Vanguard fleet had won, but the cost of victory was heavy. Frost's team sat in silence, the weight of what they had just endured settling over them. The battle was far from over, and while the flagship had been taken down, the Xoreth were not defeated, yet the fleet was still in danger, and the war would continue. Frost sat in the cockpit, her hands resting on the controls as the shuttle veered toward the Lionheart, the flagship of the Vanguard fleet. The ship's massive form loomed ahead, its weapons still firing on the remaining enemy ships that had been circling the battlefield. The crew aboard the Lionheart had been waiting for their team's return, and now the mission was complete. Frost knew that they had done their part, but she also knew that the fleet had much more to face before the war would be over. As the shuttle docked and the hatch opened, Frost and her team made their way to the bridge where Admiral Kane awaited them. The crew was already in motion as the fleet began to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the war. But Kane's gaze softened as she saw the exhausted faces of the team. She nodded in approval for a job well done, and then turned her attention to the battlefield outside. The Xoreth were retreating, but not without leaving a trail of destruction behind them. The fleet had suffered heavy losses, and while they had taken down the flagship and won this battle, there was no time for celebration. Frost felt the urgency in Kane's words as the Admiral quickly outlined the next steps for the fleet. They would need to regroup and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. The Xoreth would return in force. They had to be ready. Frost and her team stood in silence, listening to the Admiral's orders, but inside Frost's mind was racing. The success of the mission was overshadowed by the weight of the war ahead. The Vanguard's victory had only delayed the inevitable. The Xoreth were not easily beaten, and Frost knew they would learn from this defeat. Their forces would adapt and grow stronger. They had to act fast if they were going to secure a future for the galaxy. Admiral Kane turned to Frost and her team, and with a rare moment of calm, told them they had earned a rest. But Frost didn't feel like resting, not now, not when the war was still raging outside their ship. She knew the fight wasn't over, and that the next battle would be even more brutal than the last. But for now she would take the brief moment of peace as they all had earned it. The Vanguard fleet would press on. They had no other choice as Frost stared out the observation window, watching the debris of the battlefield drift slowly past. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Xoreth were only just beginning their full-scale war, and that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The battle for the galaxy was far from over, and Earth's strongest fleet would have to be ready for whatever came next.